Hello. In my last video, I was discussing some of the factors that contribute to leaders making unethical decisions. We were trying to understand why we have bad leaders. So, in the last presentation, we went over two of the major category of those factors. One was the different motivational reasons why leaders make unethical decisions or take unethical actions. Then we also discussed some of the personality factors that contribute to unethical practices amongst leaders. Now, in today's presentation, we will go over the remaining factors that contribute to unethical decision making and unethical actions by leaders. And we will start with the decision making processes that leaders engage in. How, when the decision making process is faulty, leads to leaders making unethical decisions or taking unethical actions. So, all of us have different assumptions about the world, about others, about ourselves, and often we do not question these assumptions. We take them as absolute truth, right? We assume them to be true. We do not see them as assumptions. But all of us do have assumptions, and when we make decisions based on those assumptions, and if those assumptions are not rooted in reality, then you can imagine we will make faulty decisions. And some of those decisions could end up being highly unethical because they may have negative impact on different groups of people. So let's start with the first point that is discussed here, theories about how the world operates. Or, in other words, we have assumptions about how the world operates. Now, your textbook, of course, does not go into huge detail of the various theories or various assumptions that people have about how the world operates. But if some of those assumptions are incorrect, then you can imagine we will make decisions that are faulty. One theory that comes to mind, again, this is not a theory, this is the word theory here is used as assumptions that we have about the world. Okay, so one such assumption is what is called the just world fallacy or the just world hypothesis. We use the term fallacy because it's a incorrect assumption. So what happens in the just world hypothesis? In the just world hypothesis, people believe that the world is completely fair. What happens if you believe that the world is fair? Then people get what they deserve. The ones who are successful, the ones who have everything that they want, um, the ones who are doing well, they deserved it. And the ones who do not have things, or the ones who have suffered a lot, they also deserve what they got, right? So you can imagine then how such an assumption can lead leaders to make decisions that are extremely harmful for certain groups of people. It could lead to blaming the victims of injustice. It could lead to the leaders neglecting the needs of people who are not as successful or not as privileged as the leader himself or herself is, right? Because if the world is just, and these people then deserve the kind of low salary that they're getting, or if certain groups of people got harmed, then again they deserved it, right? Because the world is fair. And there are many other such, fallacious assumptions that people, and in this case leaders, may have. Another thing that comes to mind is what we call technological determinism. What happens in technological determinism? If you assume that any technology, it is neutral, um, that it is completely autonomous, it is neutral, and it is not, that it does not impact um, the social, ethical, psychological, and political aspects of our lives, then again, what's going to happen? Then we are going to only emphasize the benefits that come out of technology, right? That technology is neutral, it's just based on how we use it. That's the kind of assumption we may have. But certain technologies inherently can be leading to we making decisions that have strong negative impact on people. One thing that immediately comes to mind is that of social media. What do the social media platform owners talk about? They talk about how it has simplified communication, how it has made it easy for people to express themselves through these platforms, which are all true. But uh, they do not talk about the addictive part of social media, how it has led to online addiction, how it has led to higher incidence of hate speech, disinformation, and even polarization in the community. So if you believe that technology is neutral, then you will ignore such aspects of such negative implications, impacts of your technology, right? So what you believe does impact the kind of decisions you take as a leader, and what you ignore, what you pay attention to. Hope you are following this. Another, again, theory about how the world operates that comes to mind is uh, shareholder primacy, right? Many leaders may believe that the primary goal of the company is to maximize the shareholder value. If that's what you believe, that's how the world should operate, then what's going to happen? You are going to neglect the needs, the voices of other stakeholders. And who could be those other stakeholders? They could be other employees, customers, the environment, right? So hope you are getting an understanding of how these faulty decision making models, mental assumptions that you have, could then lead the leader to make unethical decisions. Now, let's talk about how the assumptions that the leader has about other people can also lead to they making unethical decisions. Your textbook talks about two such factors, though there can be other factors, and in interest of time I will just go through these two factors right now. So one is ethnocentrism. What is ethnocentrism? It is this belief, it is this assumption that my culture, that uh, the culture that I belong to, or the religion that I belong to, is superior than that or those of others. So, if that's the kind of assumption or belief that I have, I'm naturally going to discriminate against people from other cultures, from other religious ethnicities, uh, or people from other religious backgrounds, right? Because I believe my thinking is superior. All this uh, exploitation that happened during the slavery period uh, happened again primarily because of ethnocentrism, because uh, the white race believed that the black race were inferior people. So they did not, the white people, then again, when I'm saying white people, I'm not saying everyone, of course, needless to say, but those white people who had that strong ethnocentric bias, they did not use the same moral standards or the same kind of treatment standards that they shared with their own people. They had different standards for the black people and different standards for the white people, right? So while it was not okay to be discriminatory against another white person, it was okay to be discriminatory and even abusive against a black person. It was happening because of this strong ethnocentric bias. And this is something that happens a lot even today, when not necessarily in form of slavery, though that could happen as well. You could imagine that a corporate uh, CEO may hold different standards for the employees when, let's say, the factory is set up in United States versus when it is, let's say, set up in Philippines, right? If you have this strong ethnocentric bias, you may not treat the factory workers in the Philippines setup with the kind of dignity that you do provide to the employees in America. So these are the kind of unethical practices that can happen because of ethnocentrism. Stereotyping is, again, you can understand, I could have negative stereotypes, negative beliefs about different groups of people, based on gender, based on religion, ethnicity, and again, I could discriminate against them because of such beliefs. And um, so we need to be really aware of the kind of assumptions that we have. That's how we can minimize the biases against other people. That's how we can minimize the uh, extent of suffering that we cause in the world. So let's go through the assumptions that now leaders may have about themselves. So if a leader has this assumption that he is the best, he or she is the best, if this leader is highly overconfident, then what's going to happen? Um, he or she may completely ignore the feedback that the employees are providing him because he knows best. He is such an overconfident person. He may literally dismiss any feedback, any dissenting opinions uh, in a meeting, right? Which would then lead to groupthink, which what it is. So I won't necessarily elaborate much on that. Even the narcissism personality trait that we discussed, people who are narcissistic, they also have certain assumptions about themselves. So we can think of narcissism also as a faulty decision making model, the kind of assumptions that these people have. They may believe that they are the most important, the most deserving person in the organization. And if that's the kind of assumption you have, then you will, of course, prioritize your own interest, your own desires, your own needs, your own image over those of others, right? So you can then imagine how this would lead to unethical decision making, unethical practices. And also, do remember that just because I discussed overconfidence and narcissism, which are all kind of self enhancing kind of assumptions, um, that always need not be the case. Sometimes the assumptions that a leader may have can be in the opposite direction. For example, I think I had spoken about this in one of my last videos, imposter syndrome, where people assume, they believe this to be true, that they are not competent enough, that they do not deserve the um, position that they are in. So if you are on the negative extreme of um, this kind of assumption, again, um, you as a leader may actually be making some strong ethical um proposals, but because you have such low opinion about yourself, you may not give it the kind of importance that you should have, right? So that again could lead to unethical decision making, unethical practices, because you may then get completely swayed by, let's say, a very charismatic um, person in the committee who uh, takes over your thinking system, and then you make decision based on this unscrupulous but charismatic person in the committee, right? So from this discussion you should be able to understand how our different assumptions that we have lead us to either make ethical or unethical decisions. So it is really important for us to be, as much as possible, to be aware of the kind of assumptions that we have. Now we will talk about few other factors that contribute to unethical decision making and unethical actions by leaders. One of those factors is what we call lack of moral imagination. What do we mean by that? Essentially, there are three components of it, but you can imagine you are more likely to make immoral decisions or unethical decisions if you are not even aware that the decision you are taking has a moral dimension to it, right? So this is what we are talking about when we are talking about the sensitivity to ethical dimensions of a situation. Almost all the decisions that we are taking, um, almost all our actions, if you think about it, they all have a moral dimension to it, because it does impact either us or others in some or the other way, right? So then we have a moral responsibility to act in ways that is good for everyone concerned. But often people do not realize this, so they lack the sensitivity, or the moral sensitivity, which means they do not realize how their decisions, their actions actually has moral dimensions. So that's the first aspect of the failure of the moral imagination. A second aspect of it is perspective taking. Are you being able to think from another person's perspective, or are you all stuck in your own head based on how you think? Perspective taking is similar to the kind of phrase that you would have heard before, being able to walk in somebody else's shoes. So when you are being able to do that, when you are being able to take the perspective of somebody else, then you are much more attuned to the needs of that person, of those people, um, which means then you are more likely to make ethical, moral decisions, right? And something that will not harm them. But if you are not attuned to the needs of others, if you cannot place yourself in other people's shoes, if you cannot take that perspective, it becomes very difficult for you to make any ethical or moral decisions. And sometimes, even if you are capable of putting yourself in other person's shoes, and you also have the ethical sensitivity, that may still not be very helpful if you lack the uh, capability to come up with solutions that are um, going to take care of everyone's needs, right? So you need that creativity, that innovativeness, to be able to come up with solutions that are ethical and effective for the organization, right? And that it helps everyone in the organization. So you need a lot of, you know, intelligence and creative capacity to also make moral decisions. And when you lack that, of course, then you do not succeed as well. The next factor that we are talking about is moral disengagement. So, by moral disengagement, what we are trying to understand is People know often that what is right, what is wrong, yet they engage in immoral actions, yet they engage in actions that are wrong. So, obviously, what is happening is that somehow in their brain they are being able to disconnect themselves, disengage themselves from those actions. Uh, that's how they succeed in committing the immoral acts that they are doing. So, this process, this mental decision making kind of process, this thinking process of how we tend to justify our immoral actions, or how we somehow disengage our own ethical self from our actions, that process is broadly called moral disengagement. And this can happen in numerous ways, right? So you may, through some form of rationalization, essentially convert an immoral act into a moral act in your own mind. So that's one broad category uh, of ways through which you morally disengage yourself. Um, uh, First one that is being mentioned here is called moral justification, right? So in your mind, you essentially convince yourself that what you are doing is actually not harmful, but is actually moral. It's actually beneficial. But yes, this does happen. You may bring up a different, higher purpose for the immoral actions that you are taking. The immediate example that comes to mind is that of Twitter, right? Um, Prior to Elon Musk taking over Twitter, the management at Twitter, they were, you know, uh, suppressing free speech. They were blocking people. They were banning people from the platform, and so they know it's not that these are people who have had training. So that Gade, that person, her name was Gade. I'm forgetting her first name. She was a person from Indian origin who was responsible for deciding whom to keep and whom to fire from the platform, right? Or whom to ban from the platform. And she it's not that she did not know the importance of free speech. As long as somebody is not engaging in explicit hate speech that can potentially harm others, there should not be any reason, again based on the different codes that exist in the United States, to ban them from the platform. But what she was doing was, she and the other people in the top management, they were doing was that they were banning people who had political affiliations or had political beliefs that were dramatically different from theirs. So how could they do engage in such explicitly immoral acts? Because probably they could rationalize in their mind that they are preventing a, let's say, in their mind, a bad person like Trump from coming and taking over, right? The political discussion. So to prevent a bad this so the higher purpose was to prevent so-called bad people from taking control of the political discourse. So with such rationalization, they could then engage in actions that were against the principles of free speech that they espoused to uh, carry through, right? So that's an example of moral justification. And there have been numerous such examples from the history. But let's quickly go through some of the other things. Euphemistic labeling. So this is something that a lot of people do, a lot of organizations do, sometimes consciously, sometimes subconsciously. So the initial labeling, of course, had probably been done consciously, but then people uh, continue to use such euphemistic labels, and that downplays the immorality of many of those actions. Like, for instance, the Nazis, instead of saying that they were killing and exterminating the Jews, they called it the final solution, right? Final solution. It seems much more positive than exterminating the Jews. Or in Cambodia, the communists, they had these resettlement, camps, which it sounds such positive, but what they were doing is they were literally forcing millions of people living in the urban areas, in the cities. They were forcing them into the rural areas and forcing them to in those labor camps where they had to work extremely hard, uh, without any proper food, and even being killed for not being able to do the kind of physical labor that the communist government wanted them to do. Similar things have happened in other communist governments too, like in Vietnam, China, Russia. The term that they used was re-education camps, right? Sounds such positive things, but what were they doing? They were forcing any political dissidents, any intellectuals who had opposing ideas to the government into these forced labor camps where they were kept in extremely inhumane conditions, where they often got killed. But they were supposed to be re-education camps. So such labeling not only um, makes it easier for people to engage in such uh, atrocious activities, but it also the helps them to convince the world that they are doing some good. Of course, your textbook talks about, instead of saying firing people, they will say restructuring the organization. Again, restructuring the organization seems so positive. They are not saying firing people away or laying off people. So these are some of the ways through which uh, the managers, the people responsible for decisions, they disengage themselves from the atrocious actions that they are taking. Advantageous comparison, right? This is something again which is very common, and these are all different form of cognitive biases. In a way, we we think in a certain way to justify um, the wrongs that we are actually doing. So you may justify, oh, our company does not exploit workers like the X Y company that does, right? So in comparison, we are so much good, so much better. Somebody accuses you of discrimination, and you then, oh, but I do not discriminate like the uh, ABC group does, right? Or people working at the ABC group do. Somebody may accuse you of harming the environment based on the kind of mm, damage that you do to the environment from the byproducts, but you can justify yourself. But we are not like the petroleum companies, let's say. They do much harm, much greater harm. So these are some of the mechanisms through which people tend to justify. This happens in pharmaceutical industry, in whole host of uh, places. You can't even imagine. So essentially, they change the frame of reference. They compare themselves with other people or other organizations who are doing worse, and through that comparison process, they make themselves feel good, um, and justify their own immoral actions. Displacement of responsibility is like minimizing harm, right? They, they downplay the harm that they caused to others. They may say, like, we were just following orders. So I'm not responsible uh, for killing all the Jews that I did. I was just following orders. So, or you may minimize harm in form of statements like, it didn't impact them as negatively as you're imagining. So this is similar to the displacement of responsibility. Minimizing harm is similar to the diffusion of responsibility too. They're pretty similar. So in diffusion of responsibility, what happens is that you spread out the responsibility amongst a lot more people, which then makes you feel less responsible. So you feel like you cannot be held accountable, because it was the, like it happens, it's the committee that made the decision, not me. um, so we see this happening in all possible directions. There is a very common phenomenon that has been studied extensively in this field of social psychology, which is the bystander effect. What happens there is that uh, people may not help somebody in need. Let's say somebody experiences an accident, but you do not help because you see a lot of other people in the vicinity. So you assume that somebody else will take the responsibility, somebody else will intervene and help these people in need. But everyone thinks like that, and consequently nobody helps. This is something that happened. One of the famous cases was a woman who got raped uh, at a place where there were a lot of other buildings from which everyone could see, but no one even bothered to call the cops, forget intervening and trying to prevent the rape from happening. The woman was actually raped and killed because everyone assumed that somebody else would be calling the cops. So this is what is the bystander effect. What's happening here? What's happening here is um, responsibility is getting diffused amongst a larger group. So no one seems to be feeling personally accountable. People are not realizing that at a personal level, irrespective of whether others are taking the decisions in in consonance with morality norms, doesn't matter. I am responsible for any situation that I am in. I need to take the moral decisions, irrespective of whether others take it or not, right? So I am personally accountable as well, and this happens across the board. The groupthink phenomenon that you would have read and studied in many other classes, including in my other classes, happens also because of such diffusion of responsibility. No one speaks up because the expectation is that others would be speaking up. So that's how groupthink happens. Incorrect decisions are taken, which lead to disastrous results. Cyberbullying, um, or even hazing, happens because of, again, diffusion of responsibility. You as a human being probably, if it was in person, you probably will not be engaging in kind of bullying behavior that you do in an anonymous online kind of community, because there is that distance there, and plus the online community may provide you a sense of anonymity, which then makes it easier for people to engage in such bullying behavior. Or in case of hazing, that of course is not happening at a online level. It may be happening in a group, but it's the group that is hazing um, an individual or few individuals. So the responsibility is getting diffused in the group, so no one feels like one person is physically and emotionally harming a group of new members, right? So this is how such justification happens in our minds. So we have to be extremely mindful of such justification. The next point is disregard or distortion of the consequences. And this is something that I have spoken about before. So you minimize the suffering, you hide the suffering, sometimes very consciously. um, or you may also emphasize the positive benefits that may have come from your actions. Just because some positive benefits came from your actions does not mean that you did not commit some atrocious, horrible acts, right? So, but these are the kind of distortions that people make in their mind to justify their actions. So these are all examples of moral disengagement. The last two uh, types of moral disengagement are all about devaluing the victims. So it's almost like victim blaming. Dehumanization is this idea of uh, essentially talking about and even thinking about the people whom you are targeting, not treating them as even humans. This is what the Nazis did. For instance, they called the Jews vermin, um, right? So if you are treating human beings like they are pests, that's the kind of language that you are using. So it is opposite of euphemistic language, right? So you are essentially using the kind of language that dehumanizes the other group or other people, um, which then the N word was used again in the United States. So you are dehumanizing the other person, and when you think in your mind and you use words that makes you feel like the other person is not even a human being, then you feel okay to commit all kinds of atrocities on that person or the group of people. This has happened even in religion, where anyone who did not believe your idea of um, who the true God is becomes an iconoclast or an infidel or an kafir or whatever uh, terms that are used in different religions, and that then allowed them to commit the kind of atrocities that they did against people who did not subscribe to that belief system. So you are dehumanizing the other group who just has a different belief system, who may just believe in you know many gods or pantheism of gods as opposed to singular God, and that too my singular God, not the singular God that you may be thinking is your God. So anyway, these are all mechanisms through which people justify their immoral actions. The last one, where also devaluing happens, is the attribution of blame. Right? You blame the victim. You blame the victim by saying he started it or she started it, or like for instance in rape, uh, she provoked me. That's the reason I did what I did. That's the kind of, so you're attributing either complete or part of the blame on the victim. That's how you devalue the victim, and that's how you make yourself feel good that hey, I did not do um, things that are immoral. So you still succeed in maintaining uh, the men- the belief that you are a moral person, you are a nice human being, but still commit all these horrible acts. So developing this ethical expertise is critical. It's very important, and it is not a very easy job. You have to be aware of your assumptions, of the kind of mental biases that go in your mind, um, and you need a lot of structured training to develop the ethical expertise, where you then succeed in taking decisions that are likely to be more ethical. Again, no amount of training, no amount of experience makes you immune from making unethical decisions. We know, some of the people whom we have respected the most have also had certain aspects of their life where they made decisions that are of questionable morality, or not only questionable morality, but of clear immorality. And there are numerous such examples, some of which you have heard me discuss in the classes. So, without going into all those details, you I hope that you understand how important it is to develop ethical expertise. People often assume, oh, it is all about taking moral decisions, and I'm a moral person, so I will naturally make moral decisions, but that did not happen. Um, Often, the most horrible of decisions and actions are taken by people who believe themselves to be highly moral individuals. So, so the last set of factors that we should be talking about are the contextual factors. And again, this is something that you have heard from me in many other classes. Um, so it is not just the leader factors that lead to leaders taking immoral or unethical route, but the contextual factors also contribute. Contextual factors could be the followers, the nature of the followers living in the environment. They could be highly conform, highly people who do not have the inclination or ability to speak up, for instance. If you live in such a if you are the leader of such a group, then the probability that you will take unethical actions increase, because no one is there to put a break on your unethical decision making process, right? So the nature of the group that you are leading, that is contributing to your unethical decision making. How is the organization structure where you are working? It may be maybe an organization where there's cutthroat competition, that the culture of that organization is dog kind of world. If you are functioning in an organization like there, again, that culture will impact your own thinking process, and then naturally you will be more likely to also engage in similar kind of uh, decisions and actions. So we also need to be aware of these contextual factors. So essentially, what is being said, and this is something that I have discussed in many of my leadership classes. Leadership is not just about the leader. Leadership is about, it's like three concentric circles that you can imagine. So there is the leader, there is the follower, and there is the environment in which the leader makes the decisions, the situational factors. So all these factors contribute to both the leader's effectiveness as well as leader's ineffectiveness or destructiveness. So if we are talking about effective leaders, there are factors within the leader, circle number one, that impact leader's effectiveness. The factors within the followers, uh, follower characteristics, follower motivations, they also contribute to leaders' effectiveness. And the third, like environmental factors, uh, the conduciveness of the environment, uh, all those factors also contribute to the success of the leader, the effectiveness of the leader. Same thing happens also when leaders are destructive, when leaders take immoral decisions. Again, this is not to diffuse the responsibility from the leader, but to recognize the fact that um, other factors come into play as well, right? Ultimately, as I have been emphasizing over and over again, even if there are multiple factors that contribute to the overall, you know, unethical practices that you may see in organizations, does not negate the individual accountability of any person in the organization, and that includes the leaders as well as the followers. So it's a lot of hard work trying to develop the capacity to take ethical decisions. Um, to step out of the shadows is not easy. To improve your ethical decision making capacities is not easy. You need to read up a lot, you need to um, study a lot, you need to understand the many different ethical models, the decision making models, and you need to develop your own expertise, your own knowledge, your own skills. Because remember, I had mentioned earlier, just because you have ethical sensitivity or you are being able to take somebody else's perspective does not automatically mean that you will be able to take decisions and actions that solve the problems, right? So you need to develop all those capacities to be able to creatively and intelligently solve the problems that come your way, uh, both effectively in terms of addressing the, let's say, organizational goals, as well as taking care of followers' needs, as well as making sure that your decisions are following the ethical standards that you need to um, meet. So it's a difficult process, and this can not be accomplished in just one step or the other. You know, it's a continuous process. You have to constantly or periodically assess yourself, either through formal instruments that can, you know, give you some insights about your character, about your decision making process, about your proclivities, about your biases, or through feedback from, you know, from your juniors, from your superiors, from, you know, different important stakeholders in the organization. You have to challenge yourself to work in these different situations. And again, because environment plays a big role, you need to create a supportive environment, and you know, you need to also uh, seek out the support in the organization to be able to become a more ethical leader. Because again, you realize you cannot become an ethical leader just in isolation. You need support from people to be able to do that. So to develop all these ethical competencies which we have been discussing about, you know, all these, having the right cognitive decision making competence, and you know, having the right uh, by effective disposition, we are talking about being able to manage our emotions in such a way that you make the right decisions, right? And the context, again, we have talked about. So you have to how to manage the situations, the environments, in a way that leads you to take ethical choices, make ethical choices. These are not easily accomplished. You have to constantly work hard to be able to accomplish that. So to develop ethical competencies, you have to work hard, you have to have good understanding of the all the ethical codes, the laws. You need to understand how to engage in decision making process that follow the precepts of moral reasoning, and are not taking shortcuts that allow you to make immoral decisions, right? So again, just attending a lecture or attending a class will not necessarily automatically accomplish it. This has to be a lifelong learning process. So, from being a novice to an expert leader who is also an ethical leader is a long process, and it's a continuous learning process that, you know, you have to engage in. That's the only way you can accomplish the four major categories of competencies that you need to develop, which is ethical sensitivity. We have already talked about it, where, you know, you have developed the sensitivity to where you realize the ethical aspect of your decision making process, right? Then having the capacity to make ethical decisions. For that, you need to have the knowledge about different ethical ways of thinking, different uh, theories of ethics. Um, you need to be able to do your thinking in a ethical manner, in a moral manner. So all this ethical decision making process, you need to develop that capacity, and you need to also have an ethical focus, right? To be able to make decisions that are ethical. So you need to be motivated to act in an ethical manner. So even if you have the capacity to act in ethical manner, if you are not motivated to act in moral fashion, if you are only motivated to benefit your own personal needs, then you will not act in an ethical manner. So how do you develop that motivation to be more ethical? And again, you can be doing that by through practice. So the more you act in ethical manner, the more your proverbial muscles of ethics get strengthened. So you are more motivated to work in this ethical or moral fashion. If you uh, commit yourselves to learning different moral traditions, strong moral traditions that will motivate you to act in moral fashions, right? So, and when I'm saying moral traditions, it could be religious, it could be non-religious, doesn't matter. Um, but even there, you need to make sure that it is you are still using your moral thinking skills and not blindly accepting any of the precepts that are emphasized upon in that tradition, right? That's how you become, that's how you take ethical decisions. So the last is ultimately ethical action. Just having the capacity or even the motivation to take ethical decisions is not enough. You ultimately have to act. Um, just knowing what's right, what's wrong is not enough. Having that courage uh, to act in a manner uh, that is ethical, even if it potentially harms me, that is critical, that is important. This is essentially what we call is virtue ethics. Having that capacity to act in a way that is moral, that is ethical. And so we will touch upon some of those topics in greater detail in the remaining couple of videos that I have on the topic, but this is where we will stop our discussion today. Hope you learned something new about how and why otherwise seemingly good people make decisions that are of questionable morality, or um, how they justify their immoral actions. Hope you got some great insights from this video, and hope you use it to the benefit of becoming a more ethical and morally strong leader.